Hi everyone, and welcome to our 10th and final lecture of the semester. Today we're going to be building a little bit on last week's material and talking about Plato and Aristotle on the physiology of character. So we looked at Plato last week, and as I mentioned then, Aristotle was a student of Plato's. He was another philosopher, and he lived at the end of the classical period. The main thing that we're going to be talking about is an argument that Plato presents in his dialogue, The Laws. So The Laws was Plato's final dialogue. It's also his longest work. And in it, the main characters are discussing how a city should be organized and what kind of laws it should have in order to be as good as possible and to make its citizens as virtuous as possible. And in the course of their discussion, one of the proposals that they make is that getting drunk can actually be both morally beneficial for individuals and politically good for the city itself. So, in order to understand that argument and how it works, we are going to first start by looking at four sort of important views in the background. So, the first is the physiology of emotion. The second is the relationship between age and emotion. Third, the nature of virtue and education. And fourth, the effects of wine. So I'll go through these four views, and then we'll come back to the moral benefits of drinking. So first, in Plato and Aristotle, certain mental states and emotions are associated with physiological changes or bodily conditions. Some emotional states they consider warm emotions, and others are considered cold emotions. So warm emotions, not surprisingly, are ones that involve bodily warmth and an increased body temperature. They're correlated with increased activity of the heart and with circulation, and consequently they're associated with the blood, the humor that corresponds to spring, if you remember that from the Hippocratics. Cold emotions involve a normal or cool body temperature. They sometimes correlate with a chilling of the body, and they're associated with phlegm, which you may recall is the humor that corresponds to winter. So here is an example of some of the most prominent warm and cool emotions that are relevant to today's discussion. And one of the things that you might notice is that we still continue in modern times to have some of this sort of like warm and cold connotations or associations with these same emotions. So for example, somebody who is angry can be described as hot-headed or hot-tempered. And we think of anger as being an emotion that makes us heated. We feel physically warmer when we get really angry. Sexual passion, we have the expression hot and bothered. That's another sort of like modern day association. When it comes to feelings like pity, compassion, friendship, love, this has come up before this semester, we tend to think of those as involving warmth and warm-heartedness, feeling warm toward other people. And shame, of course, is a feeling that can involve, physically blushing, and hence sort of the warmth associated with blood rushing to the face. And in terms of cool emotion, calmness and rationality are considered cool. So we talk about people as being cool-headed, for example. Fear is a cool emotion. And note that when we get afraid, we feel chilled. We often experience a literal like feeling of cold or chill or goosebumps when we experience fear. Lack of sexual desire, pitilessness, apathy, indifference, lack of feeling, those are also cool emotions for Plato and Aristotle. And again, like today, we might describe somebody who is aloof and indifferent as a cold person. Okay, so that's the first point about emotion. The second is that the human body changes as people age in ways that affect their character. We saw this in the Hippocratics too, and Plato and Aristotle have some very similar ideas. So during youth, the body tends to be warmer and moister because during that time, it's more dominated by the humor of blood. Blood is warm and moist. And remember, blood is associated with springtime, and youth is sort of thought of as like the springtime of our lives. As we age, the body tends to become cooler and cooler, they think, and also drier and drier, and blood becomes much less prominent. The physiological conditions of our young bodies are favorable for giving rise to warm emotions. So, because the body is already warm and moist, warm emotions will tend to arise easily and often. So, the idea is that when we feel anger, when we feel warmth or affection for somebody, when we feel sexual desire, those we can't feel those emotions unless there are corresponding changes in our bodies and our body temperatures. So, because young bodies are already close to those temperatures, are already warmer in general, it's going to be much easier for those emotions to arise than in older people. Conversely, cool emotional states and rationality, because rationality is associated with coolness and calmness, will tend to be harder for young people. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, the physiology associated with old age is unfavorable for warm emotions, but favorable for cool ones. So because the body is going to be cold when we're older, it's going to be harder for the bodily changes associated with anger to take place. It's going to be harder for our temperature to rise and for us to become heated and thus get angry. So none of this means that young people can't feel cool emotions or that old people can't feel warm emotions. The idea is just that young people's bodies make it the case that it's easier and more typical for warm emotions to arise in them, and older bodies makes it more difficult for warm emotions and easier for cool ones to arise. So here are some passages from Aristotle that lay this out in a little more detail. Okay, third, virtue requires the agreement of reason and emotion. This is the view that Plato presents in the Laws, and it's also consonant with his view in other dialogues and in general with the views of Aristotle as well. Now, in the Laws, Plato compares human beings to puppets. He says that our rationality and the various emotions and desires that we have are like cords or strings that pull us towards different actions and ways of life. So recall that last week we saw that Plato thinks of the soul as something that is in motion, and it's because the soul is in motion that it moves us, that we move and are able to act. This is presenting that same kind of view. Our psychological, the aspects of our psychology within us, rationality and emotion and desire, are like strings that are pulling us toward different actions and ways of life. And notice that that's a natural way to think of our psychology. We often talk about ourselves as being drawn to something or feeling pulled in two directions. That's, the language of pulling and pushing is a very natural kind of language to apply to our inner psychological states that sort of motivate us to act in various ways. And so that's what Plato's doing here. And Plato thinks that we're virtuous when our rationality and all of our emotions and desires all pull us in the same direction, namely toward virtuous action. So here is what you might think of as a depiction of this metaphor. So Plato thinks of this golden cord, he calls it golden, as our reasoning within us or our judgment in accordance with the law. Now, Plato doesn't think all laws are necessarily rational and good, but remember, he's talking about an ideal city in this case. So in a city whose laws are all sort of ideally written and rational, it would be rational and morally good to follow the law. So the golden cord within us is our rationality. But then we also have iron cords, which are the desires and emotions associated with the other two parts of the tripartite soul that we saw last week, namely appetite and spirit. So these are things like appetitive desires and also various kinds of emotions and feelings that we have. So the virtuous person is going to be someone in whom all of these things pull them in the same direction so that they actually act in the way that is virtuous rather than the way that is vicious. Okay, so education on Plato's view requires practice. So that's true of education in general. So anytime we want to become good at something and learn something, we have to practice. Think about, the process of learning a musical instrument, for example. But it's also true of the kind of moral education that produces virtuous people and good citizens. Education requires practice. And what it means to practice in the case of moral education is that we establish emotional habits. And that takes a lot of time. So, in order to grow up to be good people, we have to start practicing virtue from the time we're very young. And there's another reason for that. Another reason why moral education has to start really early, which is that that's when we're the easiest to educate. Plato believed, rightly, presumably, that people are the most impressionable while they're very young. And while we're young, in particular, our warm emotions can be molded and manipulated through social pressures and influences. So think about emotions like admiration, love, shame, anger, and the way that these can be sort of affected and are hypersensitive while we're young to the influence of those around us, especially our family and friends and peers and people we respect. So, think about how when we're young, we might be told stories about, noble individuals. And this was true in Plato's time as well. Young people would be told stories of, heroes. And the idea is that in the telling of this story, in talking about this heroic person and speaking of them with admiration, what adults are signaling to the children they're telling the stories to is this is the kind of person that deserves admiration. This is the sort of person you should try to be. This is the kind of behavior that's worthy of emulation. On the other side of things, think about how when you're a child, how sort of embarrassed and ashamed you feel when your parents are mad at you or disappointed in you. So the idea is that when we're young, our warm emotions, which tend to have this sort of social nature, warm emotions, spirited emotions make us care about other people. That's when we're especially susceptible to being educated and influenced morally. Okay, so the fourth point is about the effects of wine. Wine, on Plato and Aristotle's views, produces effects that mimic the physiology of youth temporarily. They make the body warmer and moister. So when we drink wine, we feel, our body temperature rising. We might feel like flushed by having consumed alcohol. And so they think it literally makes the body warmer and moister while we're intoxicated. And as we've seen, those bodily changes are correlated with mental states and certain kinds of emotions. And because of that, wine also affects our psychology. So in particular, it intensifies warm emotions, it makes them stronger and more intense, and it also intensifies feelings of pleasure and desires for pleasure. On the other hand, it weakens our cool emotions and impairs or completely occludes or eliminates our rational thought. So in these passages, from the laws, they're talking about how things like perception and memory and reasoning and opinion, these things desert a person when they're drunk, whereas things like pleasures, anger, and lust become intense. So our warm emotions intensify, our cool emotions become less intense when we're drinking. Okay, so that brings us now back to why drinking is morally beneficial according to Plato's arguments. So he thinks that it can be beneficial, but there's an important caveat: only if it takes place under supervised conditions in public festivals. So Plato is not arguing that private citizens should just be like getting wasted on their own time with their friends. Rather, there's going to have to be very specific circumstances and public events where drinking takes place under supervised conditions, and that's when it can be morally and politically beneficial. So it turns out to be a little less fun than you might think. So Plato defends three main benefits of getting citizens drunk under these conditions. It gives insight into people's character, it helps people practice emotional resistance, and it facilitates the re-education of adults. So I'll go through all three of these things now. So how does it give insight into people's character? Well, generally speaking, it's hard to know what exactly is going on inside someone's psychology, what's going on inside their minds. The main way that we know what goes on inside someone's psychology is how they act, what they say and do. How people act and their behavior gives us clues about the sorts of things going on in their underlying psychology, because it shows us the sorts of desires and motivations that they have. Here's a problem, though. People who are self-controlled, on Plato's view, lack virtue, but they typically act the same way that virtuous people do. So how can you tell them apart? Let me explain this problem in more detail in terms of the puppet image. So take somebody who is a clearly not virtuous person for Plato. So remember, a virtuous person is someone for whom all of their emotions and their reasoning all pull in the same direction, namely this direction toward virtue. Now, if someone is indulgent, that means they're acting in the way that is in accordance with bodily pleasure and contrary to what is rational and lawful. So that the dotted line here means that this desire was not strong enough to win out in the battle. So maybe the person believed they shouldn't act this way, but their desire for pleasure was too strong, so they ended up indulging and doing the wrong thing anyway. Well, in this case, it's easy to tell that this person is not virtuous. We know that it can't be the case that all of their desires pull toward virtuous action, because they in fact acted in the opposite way. And because they acted that way, that shows that there must have been desires and motivations they had that pushed them in that direction. So this is the uncomplicated case. This is not a problem so far. This is what the virtuous person would look like. The virtuous person is someone who, their reasoning pulls them in the right direction, and all of their emotions and desires pull them in that same direction. So they're somebody who was raised properly on Plato's conception, and because of that, they have the right emotional habits that pull in the same direction as law and reason, and they do the right thing. But here's where the problem arises. Take somebody who's merely self-controlled. This is somebody who judges that they should do the rational and lawful thing, but they also have a lot of desires and emotions that are pulling them in the opposite direction. So they feel conflicted. This is somebody who doesn't count as virtuous for Plato, because they have a bunch of desires that are pulling them toward vicious behavior, immoral behavior, unlawful behavior. There's all sorts of bad things that they want to do. However, their reasoning happens to be stronger, so they end up doing the right thing. But they nonetheless don't count as virtuous, because if they were, all of the iron cords would be pulling in the same direction. So the problem is, we don't have much insight into people's psychology except how they act. But the problem is, the self-controlled person and the virtuous person act in the exact same way. So the problem is, self-controlled people control themselves. The problem is that self-controlled people control themselves with rationality, So it's hard to tell whether they have these emotions that are negative at the same time. So here's where wine comes in. Wine temporarily gets rid of our rationality, but intensifies all of our non-rational emotions and desires. So when we get drunk, we act however our non-rational desires incline us to act. So wine gives you this insight because it allows you to see whether somebody has morally bad desires that they're usually just repressing, or whether they don't even have such desires in the first place and hence are truly virtuous. So in a drunk person, in other words, what drunkenness does is get rid of rationality. We no longer think clearly when we're drunk. We no longer can be ruled by our rationality. And so if reasoning is the only thing that's keeping us from acting on bad desires, then once reasoning disappears and a person is drunk, we'll see that they actually had these bad desires all along and now they're acting on them. On the other hand, if somebody is drunk and they do the right thing anyway and continue acting in lawful, rational, good ways anyway, that will show that they don't have these bad emotions at all. All of their emotions and desires are already pulling them in the direction of reason, and hence they are truly virtuous on Plato's view. So what drunkenness does is give you this tool that allows you to get insight into people's character that you wouldn't otherwise have. It shows you what their psychology looks like if reason isn't there, and hence shows you what kinds of non-rational desires and emotional states they have, and whether those are lined up with virtue. So it's a tool that political leaders can use to gain insight into the character of their fellow citizens. And in a city like the one Plato is talking about in the Laws, this is really useful because he wants to appoint people to positions of political leadership and power and judgeships and that sort of thing who are truly virtuous. And this allows an extra sort of epistemological tool for leaders to use to see who actually is truly virtuous and who is merely keeping themselves under control, but actually has some vicious or bad desires. Okay, so that's the first benefit, moral benefit of drinking. The second is that drinking provides a chance to engage in some practice of emotional resistance. So it's important for Plato that we become virtuous by practicing. And one of the things that we are always going to have to practice doing is resisting temptation and pleasure. Remember that for Plato, pleasure and appetite are the greatest obstacles to virtue in the soul. They're the things most likely to lead us astray and lead us to do the wrong thing. So we need to be good at resisting them when they arise. The more we practice, the better we're going to get at that. Here's a problem, though. If we only practice resisting really weak desires, then we won't be morally or emotionally equipped to resist strong desires if they ever arise in us. But drunkenness can be useful because it makes temptations and pleasures stronger, and because they're stronger, it makes them harder to resist. So drunkenness doesn't just make warm emotions like anger and shame stronger. It also makes pleasure and the desire for pleasure stronger. So Plato thinks that when we get people drunk, we can encourage them to practice resisting temptations. And by doing that, because their pleasures and desire for pleasure will be stronger than usual, we'll be allowing them to engage in something like emotional strength training. So, just like if you're training at the gym and trying to become stronger, if you only ever use, say, the 5-pound dumbbell, there might be a limit on how strong you can become. But if you use stronger or heavier and heavier dumbbells and you get up to where you're lifting the 50-pound dumbbell, then when you go back and lift the 5-pound one, it'll be really, really easy for you to lift. Similarly, the idea is that getting drunk makes our pleasures really intense. It kind of makes them like heavier dumbbells. And so if we can practice resisting those, even when they're intense and succeeding, then we're going to be really, really sort of emotionally and psychologically strong in the face of vicious or immoral appetitive desires. And the third moral benefit of drinking has to do with the re-education of adults. As we've seen, when people age over the course of their lives, warm emotions tend to weaken in them because of the cooling and drying off of their bodies. So, the emotional foundation of their virtue starts to break down. So, in other words, as we've seen, when we're young, we use emotions like shame and admiration and friendship and love to sort of exert social and cultural pressure on young people to acquire the right dispositions, to feel ashamed of bad behavior, and to feel motivated to engage in the right kind of moral behavior. Our emotions are very much a foundation of virtue for us, Plato thinks. However, because those warm emotions sort of tend to break down and get weaker as we get older, it means that older people tend to start feeling okay acting in morally bad ways. Later in his life, my grandfather seemed to get increasingly comfortable being rude to service personnel. That seems to be an example of this. Like, he would say things that he never would have said when he was 30, but when he was 80, he somehow didn't have the same sense of shame about treating people badly. So what wine does is, because it makes the body warm again, it reproduces sort of the physiological conditions of youth. It makes us impressionable again. And because it makes us impressionable again and makes even old people experience feelings of, friendship and shame and admiration, all of those warm emotions again, it provides an opportunity for reestablishing and restoring and reiterating the kinds of education that they received in their childhood. So when drinking parties take place, political leaders will use various kinds of pressures and influences socially to encourage virtuous behavior and shame people for acting badly. So what kinds of positive things will they do? Well, one of the things that Plato talks about in the Laws is that these public festivals will involve singing and dancing, and in particular, singing and dancing to songs that are about heroic individuals and virtuous individuals. So the idea is that by getting old people drunk and getting them to sort of like sing and dance in a collective social environment about morally good behavior and morally good people, it will help sort of appeal to and reestablish some of those feelings of admiration and shame and friendship in which their original virtue and education was rooted. And because of the intensity of their warm emotions, adults will be able to reabsorb these influences in a way that they might not have been if they had not been drunk, because, again, of the coolness of their bodies. So those are Plato's reasons for thinking that drinking can actually be morally and politically beneficial. It's rooted in these ideas that are shared by both Plato and Aristotle about the close connection between our psychological states, in particular our emotions, and our physiological states and the conditions of our bodies. I hope you enjoyed.